The best day in my grandfather's life was the day the doctor told him to not stop smoking. Because he'd been smoking since he was 12 years old. And he smoked so much that by the time he was 80-something, the doctor said, what difference is it going to make? Whatever damage has been done has already been done, and frankly, your body would go into too much trauma if you stop smoking at this point, so just don't bother. So every time that I'd see my grandpa from that point on, he'd remind me of that. He'd say, well, son, the doctor told me not to stop smoking. Best day of his life. So here I am, I'm a young guy, and I'm looking to my grandpa, I'm spending some time with him. And a day in my grandfather's life looked something like this. Most of his life was absorbed with smoking cigarettes. And here's why. He had a routine. He used to say, I get up in the morning, have a cup of coffee, get my heart going, have a cigarette to slow it down, take a pill to regulate everything, a little oxygen so I can breathe. That was pretty much my grandpa's day. And what would happen is he shook. He shook really bad. So when he played the piano, he was a honky-tonk ragtime piano player. And he was just wonderful. And I loved it. He had these old leathery hands, and he'd kind of slap at them, and they make these little slapping sounds. And he could play this ragtime piano player, but he shook. And I don't know how he did it, because he shook really bad. So when he'd smoke, he'd grab a cigarette, and he'd smoke it. But he could only take like 3 or 4 drags, and then he'd start coughing. So then he'd have to put the cigarette down, and then he'd reach for the oxygen mask. And he'd breathe over it. And once he'd get to breathing, he'd put the oxygen mask down, and he'd take the cup of coffee, and he'd drink some coffee. And then he'd decided he needed to smoke again. So he'd started to smoke a little bit, and he'd started to smoke again. Well, the problem is he could only take 4 or 5 drags off a cigarette at any given time because he'd start to cough really bad. So we had all these little butts of cigarettes all over the place. So after he smoked a while of them, then what he would do is he'd take all these little butts and he'd put them in zigzag papers. If y'all know what zigzag papers are, well then shame on you. But he'd put them in these zigzag papers, and he'd put 3 butts together like this, and he'd roll them all together. He'd roll them all together, and then he'd smoke these butts. Start to cough, get the oxygen, start to breathe, and get the coffee. And so in 3 or 4 minutes, I've described to you what was pretty much my grandfather's whole day. Because that was, this is a lengthy process when you shake as bad as my grandpa did. But he loved me, and he spoke into my life. And you know what he taught me? He taught me that real men smoke unfiltered Lucky Strikes. That's what my grandfather did.